Welcome to Directionally Correct, a people analytics podcast with Cole and Scott. And today's guest, Angela Le Mathon, fractional chief AI officer and former VP of people data and analytics at GSK. Hey, Directionally Correct fans. If you're looking to stay connected to the podcast, make sure to subscribe to our Substack newsletter, watch our videos on YouTube, or listen to the podcast on your app of choice. This podcast is dedicated to you to help educate and entertain you on how to effectively do people analytics. We are a listener-supported podcast, so please consider becoming a patron. If you'd like to support the podcast by becoming a patron, you can find a link to sign up in the show notes or at patron.podbean.com/directionallycorrect. Thanks for being a listener. All opinions are our own and do not reflect those of any other organization.
We're going to talk about AI. We're going to talk about people analytics, careers. We're going to talk about random Francophone things, my odd flexibility, my fear of ghost, but my love of incense.
Let's talk about all of it.
Yeah.
I feel like we've already started. So, let's talk about some Francophone stuff, some ghosts. Hit me with what you got, Angela.
Okay. So I think it could be, if you grew up in a Francophone environment or household, there was a lot of times where conversations about ghosts and spirits could be the voodoo elements, right? Well, all that is very fair game. And I think the way in which also stories are told, it's always like some creature's going to come in the night and get you. If you're a bad little girl or don't do as you're told, it's always like a goblin or something. So I think that being very present in my psyche, even though I'm an adult and a part of me knows better, I still have moments where I'm always like, you know what, if I enter a room or a space and it feels off, I'm always like, someone was here. And so I'm always nervous. And so my way of coping with that is I'm like, immediately open the windows, open the door, light some incense, and almost like, get the spirits out. So that is something that's very present. Yeah.
Well, let's get some spirits out. Let's have some fun today.
Yeah.
Well, so you mentioned, the spirits rather than necessarily just ghosts. And I think about, different cultures around the world have different belief systems about these things. Does that come from any of your upbringing or anything like that?
I think so. I mean, I think, I grew up in, Catholic school environments. And so there's, the Catholic guilt element and the Holy Spirit. And so I think there's some elements of that. But then I think that's always been peppered with, I guess the more natural, organic side of things that other cultures tend to embody. So I think they all mix together. I'm now very much like a yogi and into the whole yogic energy and the transcendence. So I think a part of me also recognizes that energy operates differently. So I think I'm someone who's quite comfortable with this idea of it's not just what we see. I think that's where my head is at. I think energy is more complex and layered. And so it's not just the energy that we see. There's energy in different forms. So I think I'll leave it there without scaring the audience.
No, absolutely. Well, would you call yourself a yogi? Like, is that part of your background?
I think so. I mean, I think it's 20 years in that I've been practicing. And I think through different conversations with people who practice yoga as well, I think it's time that I can actually claim it. But being a yogi doesn't necessarily mean that, you're sort of in the mountains, in the woods, kind of on your own. It just means that you have accepted certain beliefs about, mind, body, spirit, and taking ownership and accountability, right? So you don't necessarily look to other things to solve it. You recognize it's a me thing. So I think that's what sort of the principal element of the yogi dynamic is. You just sort of take accountability in a way that maybe traditionally other religions don't necessarily expect you to.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you've moved around, so you lived in a few countries. I think you've been in the US, in France, and also I think you're in the UK right now. How has that shaped kind of your perspective on the world?
It shapes it a lot, actually, because when you grow up, for example, like in my case, in the US, you have one way of engaging with the world, and there are markers that you learn. And so how you identify, how you communicate is almost, very native. You're usually engaging with other Americans. And so there's codes and things that are just very understood. And then when you move to another part of the world, you have to start over because those codes don't translate. There's different perceptions that people might have of you. You become an expat and you don't know what that is sometimes. And then there's different norms. So suddenly I think negotiating that is interesting. And then when you do it a third time, it happens again because you keep thinking, all right, I did it twice. I don't have to do it again. And it's like, no, every culture requires almost this readjustment. And then you start to appreciate that when you kind of step back, having done it 3 times, you then also realize that there's so many different streams of thinking, ways of operating and negotiating and still finding success, or success being defined on different metrics and measures. Not everyone's going after the same thing in the same way. And so it just creates this kind of really interesting, I guess, perspective on life, is that there isn't one way of looking at what good looks like. There isn't one way of interpreting success or failure, or, just there's so many things that you start to realize have multiple lenses. So I think what I take away from that now in my professional space is I'm always aware that there's multiple lenses to the same conversation. So when I'm speaking, I'm aware that people don't walk away with the same message, even though I planned it a certain way. I'm aware that, right?
Yeah, it gets the best of us.
Right? I think I'm aware that people also pick up different things. And so they put an accent on spaces that are different than what I intended. I'm always holding space for being misinterpreted, because I realize that happens quite a lot. So I just think you become quite fluid in what is being understood, what's being communicated, what's not. You get a bit more relaxed about it.
Well, have you found any strategy? Like, let me kind of dig into this for a second. So you mentioned like communication strategies, and I find, especially when you're in a data-driven profession, it's like doubly hard because not only are you having to communicate and persuade and try to influence others, but you're forcing people to think about things that oftentimes they don't want to think about, like math and data. And so have you found any strategies that you feel like work really effectively for you? And then again, you've got the cultural component as well. So it's like there's almost 3 layers of communication that you have to navigate in the profession that you're in.
That's a great question, actually. I think one of the first things is, as data professionals or analytics professionals, however we want to define ourselves, there is an element of ego tied to it, right? Because we work really hard at what we do. We're really good at what we do, ideally. And so what happens is, when we look at data or we've worked on an analysis, we sort of show up with like, this is the answer, or this is how to interpret it. And then when you sit down with, various stakeholders who have different lenses, you realize that it's different things that they think are important, or it's a different lens altogether. And so if you are rigid, then you miss it. So what I've learned to do is be very iterative with, okay, so these are the facts, so statement of facts, and then this is a space of interpretation. So I think separating those two things up front and calling it out, I think helps, because at least you know what is debatable and what's not. And then you kind of hold space for the fact that what is debatable, and therefore you're very fluid on that. I think also pausing a lot. So what I try to do is, even though I look at a situation and I'm like, I've done the analysis, this is pretty much the answer, I hold space for the fact that it's an answer to a very specific question, but that might not be the thing that is actually what's important in the room. When we're in the room, it could be other things that a leader might want to put focus on. And so though the answer might be factually correct, statistically relevant, all the things, there could be another narrative that is also quite important. So I think what I try to hold space for is just the fact that something could still be true and not be the thing that we need to talk about. And that separating out statements of fact and then sort of areas of interpretation helps to at least ensure that we're on the same page. So those are probably the 2 things I think that are the takeaways that I've kind of learned over time, is just to be flexible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And can I ask you this, because I think you've had a lot of experience in this space, in particularly being able to communicate and influence to CHROs, and the ability to kind of have them understand that, we've got a lot of different things going on in the workforce right now. We've got, all the different AI adoption. Before that, it was just adoption of data and analytics, which was hard enough in itself. You've got things like skills and the skill transformation that's going on. How do you get, CHROs who aren't necessarily like native to any of these things to understand and to feel bought in and to feel ownership and to be able to make the investments in this space to make it possible?
It's a great question. I think so. CHROs have a very different constraint than a people analytics leader. So one of the things to probably appreciate is that they have a very different time horizon than you might have. So one of the things to start to appreciate is, what does that time horizon look like? And that's typically, they're kind of 3 to 6 month, almost a year to 18 months out. By default, they're always thinking in that space. So whatever initiative that you're trying to bring to the table, you've got to almost factor it amongst that sort of timeline. And then it helps you prioritize the right time to bring it to the table. Because oftentimes when you're looking at a lot of data or looking at a lot of analysis, it's all urgent in your mind. And so you then try to bring up a lot of topics, and then you're missing sort of like when to actually bring something in. So I think appreciating their time horizon is probably really, really critical. I think the second thing is you do have to translate whatever it is that you're looking at into their sort of broader agenda or strategy. So, and that's trickier. That's a bit of a co-creation, but it is an element of saying, these are the priorities at the moment. This is what I'm looking at. And then you're really having to translate in small layers of starting from where they're at. If this is your priority, breaking it down into your world, but you almost have to take them in bit by bit. And then there's a moment you get to a certain space in your world where you don't need to go any deeper. But that's a journey you have to work on with them. So I think that's how I've had to do it, is to kind of say, this is where you're at. And then let's slowly sort of bring you towards my world, and then break it into pieces of, these are the levers. So what I did a lot of times is explain what the levers are. So there's detail, which is if you want us to double click, we can, but it's just detail. And then these are the levers, meaning if you make certain decisions on these things, it will have these other impacts. And I think separating those two things out, basically said another way, here are the strategic aspects of my world. And so depending on how you make a decision, it will have a strategic impact, and it looks like this. And these are tactical elements that we can discuss. Doesn't really have a broad implication and might be too much detail or really not super helpful, but you might enjoy it just for your own edification. And so I think separating those two things out is helpful, because CHROs are sitting at a level in the organization where, like I said, major timelines, a lot of big initiatives, a lot of complexity, the more senior, the broader. So you have to be smart around how you sort of have those conversations.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned like you've got to take the CHRO kind of on their own journey. I'd love to hear about your journey as well. So I think you've led 4 different people analytics functions, and you've got your own shingle out right now. But I'm wondering, what does it mean at this moment to have a career in people analytics? And because it seems like people are shooting off in random directions, me being one of them. But I'm wondering, like, what does that mean to you? And what are you seeing in the market for people analytics roles right now?
I think what's really interesting about people analytics now is the fact that I think the price of sort of AI and running AI programs has gotten into a space that's a lot more usable. And so because of that, I think HR functions are in a space where they can leverage sort of AI models in a way that they haven't in the past. And the person kind of best suited to translate a lot of that is a people analytics leader who's been translating their entire career, right? So we started with basic reporting, and then we got into analytics, and then advanced analytics, and then we're building LMs. And so because we've always been doing that with people data, we're uniquely suited to talk about what works, what doesn't work, to talk about how we use all of that capability to do an analytics thing, as well as potentially an operational thing or a functional thing. And so we're suited to, and we tell stories for a living. We know how to take people data and tell amazing stories. So when you're sitting with a CHRO, they don't want to talk about, the specific technologies in a way that a tech person might, because tech doesn't have the domain knowledge. They want it told to them in the story of, how am I solving for a people problem or running a strategy? And so your people analytics leader is kind of positioned to do that. And so I think what's happening now in particular is you've done the role a few times, you know what it takes to actually execute or scale any kind of analytics capability. And then now you have the ability to create data products, because now it's really easy to use an LLM, a basic one, to start to create agents and potentially multiple agents. And then now you're in a situation where you're automating a workflow. And it's like, hang on, was that supposed to be tech? Isn't operations meant to be, dealing with things like this? And so suddenly you're pressing on this interesting space where it's no longer about you coming to the CHRO with a report. You're actually talking about automating processes. You're talking about building data products. And so everyone's kind of going, wait, the people analytics leader is talking about that as opposed to this other area. And so you're basically smashing the typical operating model, and you're basically uprooting it. And so you're creating almost like this opportunity. And I think everyone is now like, oh, so how does this look? And I think we're getting pressure on this sort of AI native operating model. How do we go past these sort of old work traditional three segments of a COE and operations and, business partnering. So I think it's just we're playing in this space where we're no longer sort of like these neat little kids in the sandbox. Suddenly it's like we're playing with everyone's toys and smashing them and building better ones. And so I think anyone who's in this space suddenly has a lot more opportunity to do and go in different directions than maybe we would have had in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned something interesting about an AI native operating model. What what is an AI native operating model, and what would it look like for organizations? Because right now nobody is really running an AI native operating model, but they may be starting to deconstruct their current model and start going in that direction a little bit. But what is the end state that they should be looking for, and how is AI playing a role in in that model and in the work that's being done as an output of that model?
So I think the AI native operating models, when you start to appreciate that your workforce isn't just made up of humans, but you have these sort of, you've got humans, then you have what it's called, like, I guess, augmented workers. So humans with, additional capability. But then you also have these agents who are coming in and delivering the work of what would traditionally be done by humans. So I think the AI native operating model is almost being designed with those three core groups in mind. So typically what happens with an operating model is you design something thinking only about humans. How many people do I need to get some work done? And then you think about the skills to develop them, you think about their job titles, you think about all these other things that we traditionally think about. And that's kind of what your traditional operating model is. And then this AI native one is actually saying to you, you need to also consider that there's humans that have, some AI functionality to them. So they're literally producing more, being more productive by 20, 30%, and they look like this, and they're trained in a particular way with a particular skill set. But then you have this digital workforce that's emerging in various capacities. And so they're also doing a lot of work that would typically have gone to a human. And then you might have an exchange of how this is organized. So there's some discussions around you might have humans reporting into an agent, which is, interesting, but it's possible. You might have a leader who has a team where it's like 50-50 humans and agents, and they're accountable for both sides and performance managing not just the humans, but the models and the model performance, right? Like, we're getting into this interesting space. So to me, an AI native operating model is effectively an operating model where this is actually the foundation. It's like this is the space that we're in, as opposed to where we are now, where we're trying to squeeze AI in and mix results. So I think many companies are exploring the other side of the fence, and I think that's what's actually quite exciting.
What role do you think that skills and tasks play in this transformation? And how have you looked into that in some of the places that you've worked?
So skills and tasks are really interesting. I think, we all know about and have heard of the hype around skills-based transformations and organizations. I too was very much on that wave. And I still think it's important. I think what I've discovered over time is it's insufficient to sort of solve the bigger problems that HR is trying to tackle. And I think with AI sort of evolving the way it has, what's also emerged is that agents complete task, agents deliver task. And so what ends up happening now is as you start to think about, an AI native operating model, your starting point becomes not necessarily the skills, but it becomes more on the task and how you organize for task and how you would orchestrate humans and agents completing a task and doing it in a way that's sustainable and compliant and all the things, right? So I think that's what's turning on its head a little bit, is that the tasks are becoming more important and skills is still important, but it's becoming almost secondary or tertiary. Skills is becoming the thing that you have to then consider when you're orchestrating necessarily a workflow. And then you're kind of going, oh, I now have a gap on the human side. And then you're basically saying, well, these are the skills gap, and here you need to pick up these particular skills. Or you might try and define your agents in a way that says these are the skills that the agent is potentially delivering. But it's no longer the starting point of the discussion. So I think what's happening now is the focus, rightly so, is on how you stand up this digital workforce. And this digital workforce runs off of tasks. That's effectively what everyone's doing, is breaking down work into pieces that an agent can step in and orchestrate on your behalf to make to bring to life in a way the skills that a human being embodies. So I think that's what's actually emerging at the moment, which is actually quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, can we go back to first principles here for a second? So we had an episode with Mark Efron a while back, and if I described his viewpoint on kind of the whole skills and task in AI, he would say, at best it's old wine in a new bottle. At worst, it's a big nothing burger and doesn't really do anything, and it's just a bunch of hype. And so I would say, from a first principle standpoint, why does any of the skills and task work even matter in the context before AI and then once AI is relevant?
So I think the interest that people had in skills is that if you think about how you want to deliver value, there's a view that, a highly skilled workforce, if you organize them or you mobilize them in the best way in a company, you're going to get better value, right? And so there was a view that if I understood where those, highly skilled employees were, I could then optimize for how I get work done, right? Because we're thinking in a traditional sort of sense. And in equally, it means that certain processes that I'm running in HR, I can do more efficiently. So, I don't necessarily have to hire a bunch of people and hope for the best. If I can understand their skills up front, I have access to a broader pool because I'm not looking at maybe just a job title of the school you went to. I have access to understanding the capabilities that you're going to bring into the org. So there's a view that it's going to help me hire better. There's a view that it'll help me organize and mobilize my workforce. So if I have got a vacancy coming up, I don't always have to go external. I can identify talent pools in the organization. And then equally, I can be a lot more targeted on my learning spend. So at the minute, you might have very generic ways of thinking about how I want to develop the workforce, and it could be very hit or miss. If I understand the skills, then that means I understand specifically the skill gap. I assigned the right development plan and program, and I get you developed in the right way. And so you can immediately add value once you're back in the office. So there are very practical, components to this, even pay and how I reward you. If certain skills are really important for a company, then you would argue our incentive model would match. So theoretically, there are a lot of rationales for why it made sense. In practice is where everything kind of falls apart. It sort of never really hits the ground. So when you actually get your hands on a lot of skills data and are actually looking at it, it's not as straightforward to make some of those calls in the way that we were imagining. And I think that's effectively what ended up happening is that a lot of companies invested in skills, got the skills data, and then when they're looking at it, they're still having a lot of questions and challenges with how to operationalize it because it oftentimes can raise more questions than it answers. It creates some gray areas, especially in recruitment, as we, are observing with certain companies. And so you start to realize it's not as simple as I understand the skills of the workforce, I understand the skills that I need, and therefore I can immediately start, plugging people into different spaces. It gets trickier. So I think that's what happened with skills is that it's theoretically sound, operationally has not hit the ground in a meaningful way.
Well, let me do a thought experiment with you. I was talking with somebody about this earlier this week, and so let's imagine that AI never gets any better than it is right now. It might become cheaper, it might become faster, it might become more reliable, but it never actually becomes like super intelligence or AGI or what all these people talk about, right? How do you think that it proliferates through HR technology over the next few years? And what are the kinds of work that that the HR technology gets done? And what's the kind of work that humans are getting done? And what are kind of your decision rules for how that proliferation occurs to know which is which?
It's a great question. I mean, it's probably a couple of parts to that. So I think if we're honest with ourselves, currently in the way that we work, there's a lot of tasks that we maybe have to go through because we've got still very manual processes that many of us still have to engage with. And there's a lot of downtime in some of the work that we're delivering. This is often labeled as like organizational drag, right? Which is like, oh, it's still really hard to do basic things. So you might argue that, if we get even if AI doesn't sort of become the AGI and replaces you as a digital twin, as everyone's imagining, but if at least that type of work gets automated in a smart way, that's still a massive benefit to many companies, but also to employees, because you're probably going to enjoy the work that you do because you get to spend more time actually doing it. So one of the things I've always grappled with is, I love the work that I do, but if I actually sat down and looked at sort of how I actually spend all of my time, and then had to actually factor what percentage of my time is spent doing the work and how much is spent on admin and the sort of wraparounds to do the work, it's probably going to not be the nicest number, right? You might have a 20% to 40%, admin kind of lift. And so that changes the role in many ways, right? If agents are now able to do that for you, that means I can spend a lot more time engaging with the actual work that I enjoy, or at the very least, connecting with colleagues, creating a bit more of a, cohesion and a team culture. So I think agents would still solve, even in its current form, operational, benefits to a company massively in terms of how it feels. It wouldn't always feel so hard and painful. It would still solve a lot of basic things. I don't think we have the sophistication yet where agents are replacing humans, but if it can make our lives easier and make us more productive in the sense that we're doing the things we enjoy, I don't think that's a bad thing at all. So I imagine we're probably in that space. I don't necessarily fall into the hype that I see in the papers where I think it's something like in the next 5 years, white collar jobs or something, or entry level white collar jobs all disappear. I'm not so sure I'm buying into all those concepts. I think most of the companies who still have the ability to deliver agentic AI systems in a broad way, they still have not gotten rid of headcount. The majority of the stories are they've made a bunch of investment and they were super excited, and then they either let people go and rehired, or they have not been able to let anyone go. And so they just have an extra bill. So if we're honest, it's not as simple as just plug in a few agents, get rid of headcount. That sophistication is not there yet.
Yeah. I went through this period where anytime somebody made like a major AI announcement about how it's going to replace their workforce or what have you, we would always cover it on the podcast and be like, ooh, this is so interesting. And I've just kind of quit doing that because a lot of times they walk it back. A lot of times it's actually just publicity to juice their stock price at the moment, or like to introduce a product or something like that. And so I realized that like I'm catering to their narrative if we just continue to cover it endlessly on the podcast. And so I'm just waiting to see some realness in that market. But in relation to realness, what's a survey GPT and how do you use it? And is it good?
Thank you for saying that. So Survey GPT was a product that my former team and I had built together because we had a really interesting challenge. So large organizations, so GSK is, biopharma, 75,000 employees, and you run an annual survey and you give them the opportunity to sort of give you verbatims, right? To sort of open-ended questions. And so you get a lot of that, right? You get 75,000 comments. And so how do you make sense of that richness? And so what the team and I built was something called a Survey GPT, because the timing was such that, Gen AI launched and then it was like custom LLMs. So we built a custom LLM that helped us to make sense of our survey data. And what was really interesting was, like I said, we built a product, and rather than sort of coming to our leaders and saying, here's a report or here's a dashboard, which we still did, we were like, here's a custom LLM. And so now they're engaging and they're able to sort of, interrogate the data in that way. And it worked out really well. We first built it for ourselves, so it was helping us get better. And then over time, it was like, well, why are we keeping it just for us? We should share this love. And then we started to share it more broadly. And so that's what I mean in terms of the price of LLMs, the ability to sort of customize them and do unique things being interesting, because you're now building products. And so that's what the Survey GPT is. And I think it's really good. I think for what we're trying to ask it to do, super helpful. So
Yeah. That is super helpful. And I just think that I just keep thinking like 10 years from now, nobody's ever going to run a survey again because they're just going to be able to get all that data in real time natively. You can already do it today, but it's going to be more pervasive than it is now. But, whoever, I don't even understand. Like, I quit taking surveys. I probably shouldn't even admit to this. I just quit taking surveys altogether, like, 5-6 years ago. And I was at the time, the irony was I was like running survey programs for major corporations as that was going on. But I just didn't feel like they were as relevant anymore. But let me kind of pivot here to, I know you've done some work in talent intelligence. And so I'd like for you, I know like skills kind of falls in that space, but I'd like for you to kind of define, what do you mean by talent intelligence? And then what are some of the most impactful use cases right now and over the next few years in that space?
yeah, so when it comes to talent intelligence, so effectively, we were trying to get to the point where, we want to identify really particular talent pools. We want to understand where they are, because that's part of how you think about like a location strategy or how you might think about mobility or programs. And so talent intelligence was basically being able to look at talent pools and say, where are certain capabilities nested, if you will, either in the organization or externally. So that's how we were thinking about talent intelligence, where it's, you've got individuals with particular skill sets and they move in the company a certain way, but they're also maybe sitting in particular markets. So that's effectively how we thought of it. I don't know if you think of it the same way, but talent intelligence is effectively talent pools that we're trying to analyze. And then the skills part came into it because of how we were trying to make sense of it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I find that talent intelligence, much like people analytics, just has a bunch of amorphous definitions, and I don't really care to weigh in. And so I just trust whatever anybody I'm talking to's definition. And like, as long as they tell me what they're talking about, I can talk in their language. And that's pretty seamless. Well, Angela, do you want to join me in Cole's Corner?
Yes, let's do it.
Welcome to Cole's Corner. So, first one. What is the best, most beautiful language? French, English, or something else, and why?
I think in the research, they say it's Russian. I don't know why. It must have to do with syntax. But in my personal experience, being that I speak French and English, I'd go with French.
All right. Why?
And I think the reason is because with French, there's so much nuance and so much ways in which you can describe something. And I think that makes it delightfully complicated, but also quite charming. So I think that's why I would say French.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What's the place you've never been to that you most like to go?
I still haven't visited Japan. I have always wanted to go to Japan. I got as far as South Korea, but I still have not made it to Japan. So I absolutely want to go to Japan. Yes.
Or you were swimming from South Korea and you just couldn't swim any further? What happened?
I ended up pivoting back the other way because I had to get to India for work, and it was a missed opportunity. But I need to find my way all the way to Japan. So I will get there eventually. Hopefully next year, maybe.
Absolutely. Why do you do what you do?
I think I got into analytics because it was very concrete. Something tangible that I can kind of wrap my head around. It was practical, but also still a bit creative. And when I started, it wasn't that interesting or attractive. So no one was really in the space. So I thought, oh, this is fun. I'll have a guaranteed job. It was a bit like nursing. Like no one was really excited about this. But now it's become so competitive and it's like a thing that I'm a bit surprised when I look at it sometimes. It's evolved to such a space that everyone's like, oh my God, you're, in this AI and analytics is so cool. But none of us who started back in the day were ever thinking about all of this. So I think all of us are like, okay, sure. So yeah, it's probably kind of where it's evolved to now, I think.
Yeah, we've all kind of surfed that wave together, it seems. I'd love to talk more about that. Maybe we can talk about it at the end, just what your experience has been doing that. But I've got one big question for you.
Sure.
What is the most difficult problem HR organizations have wrapping their head around with AI and its applications? And what do leaders, users, and vendors not get about doing this effectively?
So I think the thing that I've at least picked up in my experience is probably advice. So one of the things I think the HR profession is meant to do is advise in a particular way. And I think, some of the models may or may not necessarily advise in a consistent way. And so I think that's probably what they struggle to get their heads around. So I noticed oftentimes we would sort of implement different AI capabilities and different processes. If the response wasn't always a particular thing, there was like, oh, pause it, we can't use it. So I'll give you something really, really basic. We launched Visier. Visier, has what they call Visier V, which is basically sort of like their sort of chat GPT sort of embedded into the tool. And it basically means you log in and you are, instead of sort of doing your typical dashboarding, you might go to this Visier V and engage. Well, it's like any chat GPT. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. And, it's a mixed bag. And because it was a mixed bag, they were like, nope. And it was like freeze. And it was, and so there wasn't like enough trust that, well, listen, I mean, you're in the tool, you use your judgment. It was a fear that as a company, if you respond, even if it's a false response or whatever it is, but because you've given a response, there's an accountability. And so HR professionals just have a natural fear of the way in which, that tool might advise would be different from like what the human would suggest. And so therefore that's a discomfort that they have. And then I think what's probably missing is, I think the other side was the tech side, right? In the question, I think the thing that people probably don't appreciate is how much of HR is sort of, I don't say regulated, but, employment law and some of the legal aspects of HR there's a lot of dynamics where, I think sometimes we don't always appreciate why it's complex for HR to, HR has to kind of operate or follow a particular process for certain reasons. And sometimes I think there is maybe always an appreciation for that. There's an assumption, and sometimes it's true, that, oh, this is an HR process, as opposed to actually there's a legal component to this. So I think that's probably sometimes not well understood.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Well, I kind of want to come back. I want to put an idea in front of you, just see what you think. So about what we were saying a second ago about careers and people analytics. So, and it's gotten super competitive, like you mentioned, and AI is kind of this X factor that's going on in the field. One of the things that I've seen is that, I think a lot of people with a lot of potential went into this field, and people that were more akin to risk taking. So when it was a new and it was a nascent field, nobody knew anything about it. It really takes somebody who has a lot of initiative, who likes trying new things, who maybe is willing to take a risk or two, and also sees a chance for rapid advancement in their career. And so I think you saw a lot of folks that kind of fit that mold go into the space. And again, I'm very proud to call a lot of those people friends nowadays. But it's really interesting to see that I see a lot of those folks also. It feels like the field is kind of topping out in terms of where they can apply their potential and kind of exiting and trying different things. And, one thing I don't think that anybody's really ever asked me on the podcast is like, what's the difference between working internally and externally at a vendor? And like, why would somebody who's been internally ever even consider that? And so I wonder from your perspective, what do you see that's going on with kind of our cohort of folks in this space who really want to have a high ceiling, and where does that ceiling go for them outside of people analytics potentially?
I think so. Some things that could potentially be happening is, it's a comfortable gig because HR doesn't have its stuff together when it comes to, setting up the right data programs and setting up and, analytical capability, or even going further and getting into that advisory space with AI and strategy. So I think for a lot of us, there's still a lot of work to do. And there's still like basic things that need to be delivered. So I think a lot of us are just comfortable because we know it really well. We were there from like the ground up almost. But then I think the second thing is some of the other environments that we could step into sometimes feel a bit overwhelming because they're almost overly focused on one area or one aspect of all the things you're used to working on, right? So I think that also could be where it gets tricky because I've spoken to some of my peers and there was a discussion of, oh, maybe I'll get into like a business partnering role. And some of the nervousness is like, well, only a portion of your capability gets leveraged because you're now focusing on something else. Okay, I'll go into tech. And there's also the concern of like, well, tech is, again, a very different environment in terms of how you would sort of stand up in that space. And so there's sometimes concern. Some people enjoy it, some people don't. I know some people are then getting into risk and saying, oh, I'll step into sort of a risk function. And so I think it becomes a case of like what aspect of people analytics you enjoyed. And so I think that's why you just find it to be the most exciting blend. So I think you end up staying here because you get to touch on a lot of different things without sort of being sort of siloed or pigeonholed into one. I would say being in a company, you're problem solving, right? So most of the time you're just helping to put out fires when you're internal. I think when you step outside and you're external, you're not as exposed to fires, but you're in a slightly different dynamic in terms of your freedom to express feelings about different vendors, product solutions, your ability to talk about approaches in a way that's different. You don't have to adhere to operating model constraints and concerns. So I think there is a bit of a freedom you have when you're external in terms of how you engage with stakeholders and how you help them problem solve. So I think there is a bit of a freedom to that. I suspect you might have a sense of freedom in terms of all the things you get to sort of talk about that are not always the same when you're like in the company and having to adhere to a traditional operating model and way of working.
Yeah, I think you're really hitting on a few points there. It's just a fascinating time, and I've been talking a lot about my book every once in a while, and one of the things I talk a lot about in the book that's coming out in August is just how not any functions in HR or AI are really even that much technology and data native, other than people analytics and HR technology. And as far as I can tell, HR technology has no aspirations for leadership at all. And whereas people analytics is really a function that's populated by a lot of people who have a lot of aspirations. And so I really see is who's going to lead the transformation, the AI, who's going to lead the AI native operating model for HR and all the transformation associated with that. I really think it's incumbent on people analytics to do that because they're really the only function in HR position to do it. Otherwise, other functions are going to come in and be the ones who undergo that transformation for HR, kind of force the issue. And I think that that's really the position that people analytics needs to be kind of positioning itself for right now and over the next few years.
I 100% agree with that. I mean, I think, I love HR tech, but the discussion becomes around platforms and integrations and security because they're not used to sort of storytelling and they're not really kind of sharing the same domain knowledge. And so because they're thinking in that way, they're thinking MVP and cost and scale. And I think a people analytics leader can appreciate those nuances, but we tell stories. We are trying to drive value. And at the end of the day, what CHRO or the function cares about is, why is this important? Why does it matter to change it? Why are we even talking about it? And we spend our day dealing with the so what. We spend our day then firefighting on how to scale something because if the data is not right, which we understand the data very intimately because we're being interrogated on how it's being used. So if the number isn't right or the narrative is wrong, we've got to go back and reconcile. So we're so close to the data, the quality of the data. We're so familiar with the AI models being used and how they're being used and their sort of shortcomings. And then also we know what's important. So I just think we're just really well positioned to kind of drive the function forward in a way that we just, like I said, we've been underutilized in the past, but now it's becoming easier. So I think I'm with you. I think the people analytics leader is the person to sort of kind of lead the charge in AI because I just think HR tech would struggle in a way that we just wouldn't. It's like very fluid for us.
Absolutely. Let's do some what am I reading? So the first article I've got for you, Angela, is called Do the People Make the Place? A 40-year review of research on ASA theory. So ASA standing for Attraction, Selection, Attrition. So this is in the Journal of Management. And thanks to AJ Thurston for posting about it on LinkedIn. And, the ASA theory is probably one of the best, most predictive theories ever created in the IO psych realms, the industrial organizational psychology realm. However, it fell out of favor in the last few years because of this notion, that creating homogenous cultures at work or selecting for things like cultural fit was seen as largely a negative thing that organizations could be doing. And so one of the things that they look at in this series of 40-year research review is they only found one published study that actually looked at that effect to see if there was any relationship between ASA processes leading to homogeneity. And one of the things that they found is actually firms that embrace more ASA methodology were actually the firms that perform better on the back end. And so one of the things I wanted to call out here is that there's two notions of homogeneity. And I think over the last few years, we focused a lot on things like demographic homogeneity. But attraction, selection, attrition can also apply to let's call it, cognitive homogeneity or differences in people in like what they believe. And so I always think back to Apple's, Think Differently campaign. And so if you were the kind of person who thinks differently, you probably want to work at Apple. And there's a lot of ASA that comes into that equation. And so I wonder, how did you react to this one, Angela? And what are your thoughts? Had you ever encountered ASA theory before? And what are your thoughts on this?
So I don't know directly counted ASA theory, but I do have a lot of thoughts on this. So I do think diverse teams, because I think that's the research that we're getting at, perform better to a point. I think some of the research that I've come across have been things like, there's a level of diversity that becomes unproductive because everyone can't meet in some, in the middle at some point. But then there's a certain amount of diversity that is super, super productive. So there's a sweet spot, I think, with that. But I do think what's usually happening is a lot of us as managers are not taught how to manage diversity, how to lead with diversity. So what typically probably happens in companies is that you tend to be in a position where you tend to sort of either hire or engage with your likeness in some form, not always physical likeness, but, an analytically minded person likes another analytically minded person. And so I think what that ends up doing is that you then don't create the opportunities to bring diversity to life. You might tend to, if you're an extrovert, engage better with other extroverts because you might be uncomfortable with the introverted personalities, right? And so I think all of these dynamics will come into play. And I found that I've had to even learn over time that if I want to get the best of my team, it's almost like meeting them where they're at and then finding ways to draw what's good. But it's a very different way of thinking because sometimes you're in an environment where we've defined that good looks like this. And then sometimes you are barely even that yourself for the role that you're in. So you're like, well, I've got to maintain a thing. But then you're looking at your team and going, oh. And so I think sometimes there's an almost unspoken pressure about what some of those things are. And so I think, you're right. It's like we sometimes know it's better, but then there's the culture of the company and how they navigate and operate. And sometimes that creates an obviously very interesting mix because even though a company might say they want innovation, I've been in spaces where that's what we've said, but we haven't been innovative in like years. And so even though we say it because it sounds cool, culturally, we're not that innovative. We don't mind not being innovative. And so when you then come in and are trying to be like, hey, right? So I think there's like, there's a lot of layers to it. But I think on the surface, it's actually, very factual, diverse teams, creative tension, something interesting always comes out of that. But the reality is in companies, that may not always be accepted. So you've got to almost read between the lines of where you're at.
Yeah. I want to build on that for a second because I see HR, every company has kind of their own unique culture, but HR itself everywhere has its own unique culture. And like I always kind of put it into like three camps. There's like the talent acquisition camp is like basically like the partiers, the folks that like are extremely extroverted, want to talk all this time, and they're very like they have their own little niche. And then you have like the HR business partners, very diplomatic, very like, they could work in the State Department for a different country because that's the role that they're having to play. And then you have kind of like some of the COEs and like the technologists and analytics. And I've always tried to like go to like the happy hours with the rest of the HR team. And they're always like, it's like a introverted person amongst like all these extroverts. And it's like, compared to most people analytics folks, I'm very extroverted. But compared to the traditional like talent acquisition recruiter, I'm like the weirdest, most introverted person on earth. And so it's just so funny to see how this plays out in the HR dynamics of how the function runs.
Yeah, that's so well said and spot on. I empathize with that completely because that's effectively what I've always seen too, right? So, for us to become leaders in people analytics, you have to be extroverted. So in my mind, I'm like, oh, I'm like very extroverted. And then you come around business partners and then talent acquisition and realize, oh my God, I'm like a lamb. I mean, nothing compared to these guys. So that is a bit of a learning. And then I think at the same time, though, there's a beauty to the introverts because you then have to engage with them a particular way. So yeah, I agree with that. I think that's the part we have to make space for, which is we know that these are sort of the dispositions. How do we bring that together in a way that's meaningful? How do we hold space for it and manage it in a way that means we get the best of people rather than sort of sometimes, maybe too quickly judging and therefore making the assumption that they can't do a thing or aren't eligible or capable. I think that is a behavior HR probably has to sort of figure out because each of the camps sometimes don't let others in. Because they're like, no, you don't have this. You haven't done it before. And it's like, well, if you don't open the door, I'll never do it. So I think there is a bit of that as well. We've got to kind of get over ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing. We just need to get over ourselves sometimes. But let me move on to the next one I've got for you. So I've got one called evaluating the impact of faking on the criterion related validity of personality assessments. And so this was a reshare from Thomas Chamara Premusic, but by some authors on a different research article. And basically what they found in their meta-analysis of faking on personality assessments is, do people fake? Yes, especially when instructed. Some items or questions, especially emotional stability and conscientiousness, are more vulnerable to faking than others. And we can probably dig into that in a second. And then even when people fake, after they are instructed to do so, personality assessments remain valid and useful predictors of performance, which I thought was super interesting. But how did you react to this one, Angela? And I'd love to get your thoughts.
I mean, I think we have to be honest about the social pressure of fitting in, belonging, right? I think, there's here's how I really feel, and then here's what I have to say. And that dynamic is always at play. And so many of us, when we come to work, have understood like, this is a place of work. This is a place for me to be professional. My mask has to be on, right? Like I'm not home. So therefore you show up and you sort of behave and respond like a professional. And so you say what needs to be said. And then you have if I was home or in a safe environment, with my mask off, something else happens. So I think we just have to be honest about the fact that that's what's at play with these surveys, right? There's a role I have to play, and so I play my role. And I think that's effectively what it's pointing to. And I think, I don't know, at least if I understand some of the, the latest in psychology, I don't know that we want work to be a place where people show up and are actually their real selves. I think we want people showing professionals because many of us, I'll raise my hand, we've got potentially baggage or issues that do not need to be in the office. And so I think we have to be honest with ourselves that trying to get to the, like, what are you really thinking and what's really in Cole's mind, it's not appropriate for the place of work. What we need is professionals showing up to do a job and to engage with colleagues. And so if they're doing that, well done. And then anything else that might be blocking them, we have a hotline or something that we direct you to where you call and get support. But I just think it's too much to expect a company and managers to deal with all of it. I think it's overwhelming. So yeah, I think there's a time and a place, but we need to be honest that work is a place of, work. And so therefore you need to show up as a professional. And then outside of work is outside of work, and, up to you would be my take.
Yeah. Now, I'll tell you a funny story about this. So I remember I was an undergrad and I had applied to work at a bank, and they gave me an assessment to take as a part of their selection process. And they were very gracious because I guess I failed the assessment, and they went through the results with me afterwards. And there was a question on there. And then, again, this was before I had learned a lot about psychology or anything, so I didn't really know what I was taking. And there was a question. It was like, so if one of your coworkers shows up late for work and the manager says that's okay, is that okay with you? And at the time, I remember I was actually working somewhere and I had these coworkers who were always showing up late, and the manager didn't do anything about it. And so I was like, I guess it's okay. And because, like, my manager wasn't doing anything about it. And then I realized that they actually coached me afterwards. They were like, well, this actually shows that you're less likely to show up to work on time, and you think that that's acceptable. I was like, no, I was answering it because of the situation I was in at work, and I didn't know it was not kosher. And that's when I realized that these assessments aren't meant to show, like, how you would actually judge a situation. They're actually just trying to assess, again, your conscientiousness or your emotional stability. And I should have answered and will answer from now on that showing up for work is always bad.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I just thought that was funny.
I think I've understood early on, and maybe for different reasons, that, and maybe because I went to business school, and so I knew that there was a business objective, but there's only one way to answer. It's like, you need to be a good worker, and a good worker is defined in a particular way. And so whenever you're filling those things out, you need to fill it out with the view of, what would a good worker say? And a good worker would always, come in and want to do work and be keen to go above and beyond and all the things that, as a human, you might be like, oh, that's a lot. But as a good worker, it's the right answer. So that's kind of how I think about those things.
Oh, yeah, sure. I'm just sitting over here, trying to act like George Washington who chopped down a cherry tree. Always tell the truth, and that was so dumb of me. But let's pull up the last one.
Sure.
So we've got an article called "No One Has Cracked AI for Analytics." And I thought, per the nature of the conversation we've been having, that this would be especially relevant. So by a guy named Kevin Marr, and he goes through and he talks about, like, a few different use cases in AI, writing SQL, in analytics, like writing SQL, creating visualizations and the like. And he has this checklist of, should I build an agent? And so, is the task complex enough? No. Then use workflows. Yes, use agents. Is the task valuable enough? If it's less than 1 cent, workflows; more than 1 cent, agents. Are all parts of the task doable? No. Reduce the scope. Yes, use agents. What is the cost error and error discovery? If it's high, read only or use a human. Basically, if it's low, use agents. And so I thought this was fascinating because, and I'm guilty of this as anybody, talking about how AI is really going to come, for a lot of these analytical roles, and even talked before about maybe it shouldn't be called generative AI. Maybe it should be called generative BI, because it's going to do a lot of BI tasks and those type of things. But how did you react to this one, Angela? And what role, like, has no one really cracked AI for analytics? And if not, what do you think? And if so, why do you think that this guy's wrong?
So I think it's tricky. Like I said, I think there's the facts, and you can, train an LLM to sort of regurgitate facts, which is what like the Visitor V does, for example. But I think what people have to appreciate is people data is telling a story about sort of, people in a particular context. And that interpretation becomes tricky. So, like I said, if something as basic as attrition, we always know if I want attrition, then the higher number is okay. If I was actually launching a retention strategy, then that higher number is problematic, right? But how I'm going to interpret that dynamic is really down to the objective that I might have, and it might not be obvious in my data set, or it might not be obvious in how I would even interpret it, because it might not be sitting somewhere. It might be a conversation that I'm having with the business person. So I think what makes it sometimes tricky is that I think people challenges or people strategies or people sort of issues are not always very black and white in terms of how you would solve for it. So for example, I know some companies or some functions, they have the luxury of building solutions or analytical solutions where it always tells you the next best action. It tells you what you can do next, because it's almost a bit like it's a bit more streamlined in terms of what the right answer is. And I think with people, there's always a bit of a nuance. There's always like a third thing. So if you're a business partner and you're working with your business on how to solve for challenges on people, it isn't just hire, fire, move them around. There could be so many other creative ways to think about solving for a people challenge that it becomes sometimes harder, I think, to sort of, build a tool that says this number came out, treat Bob like this. I think it's a bit nuanced. So I think some things AI has solved for in analytics because you can break it down into very operational things. But I think other things, yeah, it's fair play, it's complex, but that's the challenge. Some of it is complex. So I think, yeah, I think AI is best suited for really small, specific kind of, task or even interpretations. But some of the more complex things, that's why you need a human in the loop, because you need humans to sort of make sense of it. So yes and no. I think I agree and disagree with it at the same time.
Well, I don't know. I just feel like we live in this world that maybe not today, but if 3 years from now, nobody's going to be building a dashboard, nobody's going to be running a SQL query, nobody's going to be building a report, largely presentations will be automated, largely doing any kind of basic exploratory or descriptive analysis is going to be completely automated. And largely it's already automated today. Yeah. And so again, maybe we're like 80% of the way there, but 3 years from now, we'll definitely be pretty close to 100%, if not we'll add 100%. And so I just think that I see folks posting online sometimes about like how they built the coolest dashboard or how data visualization is like really important. And I just keep thinking, it's like, you guys, are you even paying attention? Like it's like coming straight for that work. Yeah. And you're like, I think they feel like really self-righteous. Like, I'm doing the good work of people analytics, the journeyman's work. And I'm just like, no, you're not like at all. And if anything, you're like John Henry, who's trying to lay the railroad tracks right after the machine who lays the railroad tracks way better. And then he like dies on the job, and like, it's complete silliness. So anyway, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that's a perspective that I've had.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think what's happening is you spent a long time building up a skill set. And so even if it might be dying off, you're like not going to let it go right now, because you're like, no, I'm really good at this. So I think there's some people that just don't want to let go. And so they want to show a cool thing. But I'm 100% with you. The goal was never dashboards. The goal was always a story. The goal was always a narrative. The visuals and the dashboards were a way to help you get to the story, but no one cared. If you could tell me the story without me having to go to a dashboard or look at a bar chart, I'm all for it. But I think I think people forget. It's a bit like there's like that joke where, might be in the yogi world, where like, you've got a master and the master is pointing to the direction you need to go into, and people come and they worship the finger that's pointing as opposed to walking to the door. It's a bit like that. You worship the dashboard of the visualization because you're like, oh, that's the thing that makes me special. And it's like, no, what made you special was you've identified a people challenge, and you can tell me a really compelling story. And I think these LLMs are skipping the part of having to look at this messy dashboard and play and add filters and do all this, and go right to the, based on the definitions or criteria, this is the issue, and let's explore it. And then, oh, by the way, here's some recommendations to tackle it. So I think we're skipping the part that we actually just care about the story. And that's the thing that people analytics leaders are really good at, is the storytelling. So let's not get caught up in tooling and visuals and dashboards and all the rest. That's not it. They're meant to help the story. And so let's focus on the story, what's happening with our people. And so that's what I think is the direction. I think we might have forgotten that because the tooling was very heavy and complicated, and you had to go to explain the number, and you got caught up in that detail. And so I think many of us bled having to go back and reconcile data, and a leader going, "What? That's the number? I didn't know that was a number." And you're going, "Uh-oh, oops." Right? So I think we've got some pain there. But yeah, the goal isn't the visual, it's the story itself. So we need to get back to that.
Yeah, it's the story and it's the decision making. I find this quote to be very motivating, but like if you're in a kind of a bad situation, sometimes the only way out is through. And I think we're in kind of this situation where we just need to burst through as a people analytics function and kind of turn over a new page and really think about the future. And I'm just, trying to bring other people along with me. But you're right there with me or ahead of me, Angela. And I really appreciate you. You've been a fantastic guest today. Any parting words for the audience or anywhere people can find you?
Yeah. So my new sort of advisory practice is People Alchemy. So you can go to peoplealchemy.ai and you'll be able to sort of find me. I'm also on LinkedIn, so you can also find me there. But yeah, I'm going to spend the next sort of, 10, 11 months or so just sort of playing around with a lot of AI things and initiatives and just sort of trying to figure out what this sort of frontier looks like. And so, yeah, if you're on the journey and also really fascinated by sort of how AI is going to supercharge all the work that we do, then yeah, hit me up and let's have a chat.
Well, look at you. Look at you just getting to play around with AI for the next year or so. Well done. But you've been a fantastic guest, Angela. Thanks so much for joining. And you've been listening to Directionally Correct, a People Analytics podcast with Colin Scott. And today's guest, Angela Le Mathon. Thanks for joining us, Angela.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.